So if you've been gardening for a while now, then you probably have noticed that a lot of people say if you've got healthy soil, then you'll have healthy plants. And that is very true. It couldn't be more true actually. And that's why today I'm going to be showing you some of the soil, no-dig soil this is, that I've got here ready to plant my onions into, that I'm actually quite proud of how nice it's looking. And I'm also going to be showing you my favourite way in a small space that you at home can start amending your soil using old food waste. So let's get on with the video, but before we get started, make sure you've gone down below, hit the subscribe button as well as the little bell icon to make sure you're notified next time I upload a new video. And this down here is the bed where I'm going to be planting my onions for this year for overwintering. And as you can see, the soil is very dark, and if you don't know already, the darker the soil, this is the rule of thumb, the darker the soil, the more organic matter is, and therefore the healthier the soil is. So the darker your soil is in terms of like, if it looks like a really dark wooden and floor kind of soil, then it's really good. And if you look at this, that's very dark too. And that's because, one, I'm no dig, so I never disturb the soil structure. And by doing this, all I do is I put mulches of compost on, and then I leave the worms and nature to do the rest of the work. And actually, I use these, as you can hear, is old compost bags to put over the top when I put the mulch on. If I'm not going to plant anything straight in, I put compost bags over the top. And what this does is it let the worms go and turn it all in. And that's why on here, you'll be able to see that the compost isn't just compost, it has actually mixed with the proper soil. So there's some worm castings mixed in here as well. And actually, worms is something I'm going to be talking about today, because today's video is all about my wormery. And I know a few months ago I did film a video about my wormery, but actually I don't think it's as good as it could have been. So I'm going to remake it, and this will be a bit longer and a bit more in depth than my first video was. And this will be a bit more in depth than my first video was. And I'd bet that if I told you to think of a normal compost bin, you'd think of one like this, where there's a lid, a main compost bin part, and then a hatch to take it out of at the bottom. But no, wormeries are much different. Wormeries often have layers, so normal boxes or trays they're called, and what you do is you have the oldest one at the bottom normally, and then the one that you're adding to at the top, so it's easier as well. And the worms, they have holes in the bottom, or like mesh at the bottom of these trays, which lets the worms go through and into whatever tray they want to be in. And that also means that they can also control their climate and the heat in their wormery whenever they want. So for example, if it's too cold, they'll rise to the top because heat rises, and if it's too hot, then they'll go right down to the bottom. Or alternatively, they sometimes go to the bottom and right into the middle and cluster together where it'll be nice and warm. So that's why I'm going to be speaking about my wormery today. It's because it's the best thing to use to add organic matter and nutrients back into your soil, into your garden, especially if you have a small space, because they're very small. And actually, the reason that I keep saying that organic matter is really good for your soil is not only to do with nutrients actually, but it's to do with the fact that you're feeding the things like the worms in the ground, and the healthier the life in the ground, the healthier your plants will be, because things like fungi can actually help the plants. For example, one fungi attaches to roots and stops diseases entering into the plants through the roots. So this thing here next to me is my wormery, and I'm just going to give you a brief tour or overview of what it is and all of its features. So one of these, this is made by someone called Worm City, or a company called Worm City, which are based in the UK, and it's made out of recycled plastic. And I'll actually leave a link down below so you can buy your own, as well as a nice wormery starter kit, which is excellent for when you're new to handling worms, because it has a full little booklet that tells you everything you need to know about caring for your wormery. So to start off with, it has this base tray, and this is all actually trays, but this is an upside down tray that's bolted to the rest, so really they make one tray and then you just make your own wormery. And then there's a tap here that sometimes, especially in the summer when they're quicker, will have worm juice flowing out of there, but as you can see, there's nothing coming out there at the moment, and that's because they slow down in winter, so they won't be breaking down and eating as much throughout the winter. And then you've got in here an upside down lid basically that has the tap, which is called the sump. And what this sump does is it collects all of the liquid, so this is basically wee from the worms that all goes down into the bottom and then waits there until you empty it. And I recommend that you have something underneath ready to empty it at all times and have the tap slightly open, so if it freezes, the water will just come out here, and also it won't drown your worms, because sometimes the worms can get stuck in a bit of a sticky situation down there. Coming up here, we've just got the trays where you feed them, and for example my top one here, they could actually do with a feed at the moment, but then as you move down it becomes more and more broken down until when you reach the bottom it'll be really well broken down, hopefully, just like that one. And you won't be able to see these, but I'll put some clips in hopefully towards the end of the video to show you, so make sure you watch until the end. What I'm going to be doing today as well is I'll show you how I feed the wormery, because it can be quite confusing at the start because a lot of things online say different things. So what this is just a basic, foolproof, no failure guide on how you can feed them. And I'm going to be feeding them from probably a bagged food that they came with the wormery, and the wormery starter kit just like I've linked down below, because this is just like a general good feed to give them. And make sure if you're making your own wormery to have it so it's a dark colour just like this one, because they don't like light. So if it was a clear box then you'd never see the worms on the outside because they don't like the daylight. So make sure that it's a dark colour that will block out all of the light. I forgot to add as well, this wormery is probably the most famous wormery in the whole of the UK because it's been on BBC Two, Gardener's World. And if you still want to catch me beyond when I featured on Gardener's World, I'm on episode 26, which is on iPlayer, and I'll also link that down below. So now I've got food, and I didn't get the normal food that comes with the starter pack. I just got some old kale leaves that needed to come off the plants. And something you'll also need is some good old newspaper, no glossy anything, just typical newspaper, not too much ink. And you'll also need some water to dampen them, ideally rainwater. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the top off, and actually if you want the worms to eat something quickly, the mouldier the better. And I'm also ripping it all up so I can spread it throughout their whole thing. And some bits they don't eat, like the stalk, and with the stalk then they'll just sort of leave that and it'll naturally break down as it will in normal compost. So this doesn't take too much shorter than in normal compost, but it's just often better compost that you get out the end because it's been aerated by the worms a lot more. So I just keep ripping all this up. And this kale is actually quite sticky, and that's probably because of the sucrose and all of the glucose in the plants that's making it go quite sticky and thick. And you can feed just about most things that we can eat to worms. So if we can eat it, they can eat it. But try and avoid things like citrus and coffee grounds, because that can be very toxic to them. But other than that, any veg peelings or anything like leaves, grass clippings I haven't found they like that much, but just any sort of food scraps they will almost definitely like, as long as it's not sort of anything strong and pungent. So anything like onions and garlic I try and avoid personally, but I think they can still eat it. But coffee grounds, tea bags, try and avoid them, and citrus, avoid them at all costs. The next step that you must do is add the newspaper on top of the food that you put on. I normally put about 2 inches of dampened and ripped up newspaper on, and make sure that the paper, whatever you use, is non-glossy, as this can be really bad for the worms, and it also just isn't very good if you break it down anyway. So I just use some rainwater to dampen down some old newspapers that I've ripped up into smaller pieces or strips, and then I lay it all over. And what this does is it gives a good air pocket underneath the worms, which is good, and it keeps a nice moist environment for them. This newspaper layer also prevents bad fruit flies, which is something you get when you put a lot of food in there and they don't break it down. So as I said, I'm going to show you now the mostly composted stuff in the other trays that I've got. And what's great about worm composting is that once you've got it fully established, like mine is, with all of the trays in, you can actually buy more trays to put on top. And as well as that, when one tray's finished, you put it back on top and fill it up again, so it's a full, constantly cycling. And another tip as well is when you first set up your wormery, you may want to rub the insides of the tray with garden soil and put maybe 2 trowelfuls of garden soil in there just to get all the microbes, because otherwise the worms do try and escape, and it looks, when you wake up one morning and see all your worms climbing all over the wormery, it's a bit like juggling worms trying to chuck them all back in. Not that they're that fast anyway. So what I've got is I've put the lid upside down on the floor, and because it fits perfectly, every time you take a tray off you can put it straight into the lid, which means that there's no spillage anywhere of worms or of compost. So this tray here is actually quite shallow, there's not too much in here, and that's quite close to being done. So I'll show you that now. There you go. There's 1 or 2 worms underneath that, and I'll put that on top again. And then here, this is quite shallow again as well. And there's a worm on top there that you can see. And they do move very slowly when it's cold, because they don't like being too cold, obviously. And here, this is probably where most of my worms are now, because it's nice and warm, is the lowest one, which is also the most full. And that stuff is probably going to be ready next spring. And then if you look in the sump here, as I said, the sump, earlier in the video, it's got a lot of moisture in there, which is actually the worm compost, the worm tea, or worm fertiliser. And if you put this into a watering can and dilute it 1 part of this to about 5 parts to 10 parts water, this will be a great plant food and an alternative to bought foods. It's a high nitrogen feed, so you need to feed it to things that need nitrogen, and that's about all you need to know for this now. So I'm going to put all of my trays back on, and I actually think I'm going to put the one that was on top on the bottom to try and make it so that the worms can change it up a bit, so that they're not always going to the same ones. So I'll put this back in, and this should speed up some of the composting process in some of my other trays then. So there we are. So I've put the most composted on top now, and then they'll all transfer down, because the reason they'll transfer down rather than up more is because of gravity. And there's actually, in your soil, which I'll speak about in a minute, there's 2 types of worms, but I'll talk about that in a second. Something you may want to do in winter and in summer is get something like a windscreen cover that's white or foil to try and reflect the heat back in, and also in the summer reflect the heat out, so it's a very stable environment for them. Because there's been some cases where if it gets too hot, if it's a dark colour like my one, then the worms do overheat and unfortunately die. And another consequence of worms dying is that they're quite expensive to buy, because there's something called tiger worms, and when you empty your worm compost, you try and pull all the worms out. And then actually as well, as I said then, there's 2 types of worm, or 2 groups of worm in the UK in the soils. There's the type that go up and down really high, and they're I can't remember the word for them, but they go up and down about 9 feet. And then there's also another type that goes across in the soil, which is more in the subsurface, and these will be a darker colour. So the ones that go up and down, they sort of make drainage bits for water when they go up and down, which is why worms are so good. And when you're no dig, you don't disturb all of these channels. And then the ones that go across will be darker, and this is because they're the ones that break things down, like the tiger worms. That's the type that they are. These are the ones that go across, and what these do is they break down the organic matter that's on top of the soil. So that's why when you're no dig, it's better for the worms, because they're used to having a leaf litter from the trees in woodlands, and they move across the soil and break it all down into nice organic matter into the soil, and then the other ones that go up and down then incorporate it into your true soil. So thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope that you learnt something about wormeries and it made you want to get one yourself. And if you do want to get one yourself, as I said, I'll link everything you need down below, as well as an iPlayer link for my BBC Gardener's World episode that I was on with Alfie and my wormery. Thank you for watching. Please make sure you like, comment and subscribe, and leave a comment to make sure you tell me whether you're going to get your own wormery. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.